Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Babman, and I'm the president of the HKVCA, the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association. And I'm very proud to be the son of a Hong Kong veteran, Alfred Babban of the Royal Rifles of Canada. Tonight's presentation is the third in our series of virtual events. I hope we've been successful so far in bringing you interesting speakers and topics that highlight aspects of the Battle of Hong Kong that may be new to you. There's not much that we can say that's positive about this pandemic that we're all struggling through, but one good thing it has done for us is to push us towards more innovative use of technology such as Zoom. A year or two ago, we would never have thought of offering events like this evening's to our members across Canada, much less having a speaker joining us live and in person from Hong Kong. Now, let me put in a word now about our next presentation, which will be on Monday, June 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Note that this is 30 minutes earlier than our previous presentations have been. Our event that evening will be presented jointly with the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our topic will be Canadian Nursing Sisters in the Battle of Hong Kong, and will also feature a tour of the Royal Canadian Military Institute with its extensive collection of military artifacts, including the medals of several Hong Kong veterans, and a display dedicated to one of the nursing sisters, Kay Christie. Be sure to mark your calendars for this fascinating talk. Around the beginning of June, you'll receive an email invitation from the HKVCA with a registration link for the event, and I hope you'll register. Remember, these events are open to everyone, so please forward your invitation to your family and friends and encourage them to join us. Now let's turn to this evening's presentation. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, Craig Mitchell, let me say a few words about how this virtual event will work. I think many of you have attended our previous events, so you're familiar with the process. The camera on your device is not activated and your microphone is muted. You will have the opportunity to ask questions of our speaker both during and after his presentation, though. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon marked Q&A. If it's not there, try tapping on your screen once or moving your cursor to make it appear. You can use this icon to send a text message with your question at any time. When you've typed your question, tap Close to return to the presentation. At the end of his presentation, Craig will answer the questions that you've submitted. Now, we've also set up a Facebook page for you to discuss the presentation and ask further questions of Craig, and I will tell you more about this later and give you more details later on. Now let's turn to our speaker for this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce Craig Mitchell. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Craig has had a lifetime passion for military history, and in particular, the Battle of Hong Kong. As a young boy, Craig visited the battle sites on many occasions with local and visiting veterans of the campaign. Craig leads a small team that studies the Battle of Hong Kong in meticulous detail and actively searches for evidence to document before the passage of time erodes artifacts beyond recognition. His team has successfully returned numerous personal items found on the battlefield to relatives and family members, as well as donating relics to schools and museums. Craig's interest in World War II is wide-ranging, and he has discovered, explored, and mapped dozens of Japanese wartime tunnel systems throughout the mountains of Hong Kong. His team's biggest current project is the archaeological study of two American TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that crashed during an airstrike on Hong Kong in 1945. And they discovered this crash site about 8 years ago. And Craig has some Canadian background. He's presented on numerous Canadian World War I and World War II documentary TV programs as the shows Digger and Danger Man. Perhaps he'll tell you later what those terms mean. In this role, he has visited and studied Canadian involvement at Juno Beach, the battle for Monte La Defensa with the US Canadian Commando Unit, the 1st Special Service Force, and the First World War sites of Ypres, Passchendaele, and the Somme. Welcome, Craig, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that wonderful introduction. Ever since you asked me a few months ago if I would be interested in presenting something to your association, I was really excited. And we've had a little bit of a connection through friends and through extended connections and stuff like that for the last few years. So being asked to come on and sort of present something to you guys has been a real pleasure. So thank you so much for asking me to come along and do this. So just to continue with your introduction there. Yeah, no, I was born in Hong Kong, and ever since a young lad, I just remember being up in the hills on the weekends, doing family walks, loving finding pillboxes, you know, in amongst trenches, you know, everything I could do to find anything military and historic up in the hills in Hong Kong, I was all over it. So it really kind of evolved from a very young age. I was just very aware of where things were in Hong Kong and always looking to try and go see some old gun positions. And just as Mike said there, I remember being about 11 or 12 years old, so it must have been about 91, 92, and there was a big contingency of veterans coming over. And I just remember being in awe, being taken around various battle sites in Wong Nai Chung and just sitting there like listening to the guys and just hearing their sort of perspective of it and saying, you know, seeing one guy saying, yeah, I was actually in this bunker while it was nearly getting overrun. And, you know, I just remember just being overwhelmed with just by listening to these stories and just being completely engrossed. And it's just kind of snowballed from there. So yes, I loved exploring Japanese tunnels and stuff, but I think where it really started to snowball was that about 15 years ago, I was very fortunate to get a job working at the Hong Kong Cricket Club, which is in the center of Hong Kong. And any veterans that have, or anyone that's been studied the Battle of Hong Kong will know Wong Nai Chung is probably the most heavily fought area of the Battle for Hong Kong. And right now in current day, that's where I worked. It's the Hong Kong Cricket Club. It's a beautiful venue now, beautiful manicured lawns and stuff. But obviously in 1941, it's a very, very different picture. So I was very fortunate to be able to work in that location for about 9 years. And every opportunity, I can just remember looking around in the hills and just going, I can almost envision sort of the Japanese coming over here and then relief platoons going up here. And, you know, I was just, every day was just in amongst it. So it really just kind of evolved from there. And it was working at this club that in the winter times, I was very fortunate to have a little bit of extra time. So I'd be off running up in the hills, looking for Japanese tunnels. But the whole time I would just be, my gaze would be on the floor, looking for bits of, you know, shells or artillery pieces or anything that I could just find that was part of the Battle for Hong Kong. And I'd be so happy just to find anything. Didn't quite know what it was back then. And then I kind of realized that, well, you know, just below my feet, underneath a little bit of gravel or leaves, there could be something even more special. But I have no means to do that just now. So that's where I decided to get a detector. But I knew very early on that it's not a very safe hobby if you don't know what you're doing. So I took it very slow. And for the first 2 years that I went detecting, I was very slow, very methodic until I started building up a little bit of experience there to know exactly what I was looking for and how deep it was and where it was by reading my detector. So I really got into that slowly because I knew there was a lot of danger there. But that's when I really started to read. And I just want to start sharing some of the sources that I use and the process that I go through to try to find the best locations and how we try to source out the various information to try to piece together the story there. Obviously, the first place anyone goes to is books. I mean, that's the easiest place to go to back then. Sorry, 15 years ago, probably the place these days is going to be the internet. But back when I first started looking into all of this, like 15, 20 years ago, even longer than that, there were a number of books. Fortunately, now there are actually quite a few books out on the Battle of Hong Kong. I think there's about sort of 30 odd, which mostly I have at home. Some really, really good, fantastic ones, some very sort of slightly lopsided accounts, I think, in my humble opinion. On a personal opinion, I would say that the first two books there that you see there by Hong Kong authors, Phil Cracknell and Tony Banham, are my personal favorites, but I do have to give full disclosure, they are actually personal friends of mine as well, and they have contributed to various stories in this presentation that I'll allude to later on. But trying to be as neutral as I can, I do actually think that those are the best kind of resources to use for almost, Tony Banham's one was almost like a TikTok of what happened every minute and stuff. And Phil Cracknell's another fantastic one where it really gives you a big picture of where the movement of people were. So those are fantastic resources just to get yourself going and try to work out where things were and try to understand the progression of the battle. Sorry, let me just a bit of a technical glitch here. Let me move on. There we go. The other resources that we use then try to find primary first-hand accounts. They can come from the war diaries from the individual regiments. They can come from various military sources, but generally they tend to come from the war diaries themselves. So they tend to have a lot of sort of second-hand accounts, but they also are very useful because sometimes they put little snippets of information there that you don't normally get. And also war diaries as well. I mean, diaries from personal accounts where You do have to take it with a grain of salt, especially with the Canadian soldiers, where they're new in Hong Kong. They're only in Hong Kong for 6 weeks, and they're thrown up into the battles, into unknown territories and sort of terrain in Hong Kong at nighttime in the fog of war. So it's very understandable how there can be a little bit of confusion of not exactly knowing which mountain you were or which valley you were. So you do have to give these things a little bit of leeway, but they're a great way of trying to understand exactly who was where. They might be able to say there was a group of people, or this section was made up of various assortment of people, and that just goes to help give you a slightly bigger picture of who might have been where. And with the battle for Hong Kong, sorry, I do have to say, sorry, I work in a school, and the one thing my students always tell me whenever I give these type of sort of presentations is how quickly I talk. So I'll try and take a moment, take a pause for breath, and slow down a little bit. What these diaries are really helpful for is, yeah, just giving you a general battle idea of where things were. The battle for Hong Kong on the island itself was only 7 days. I mean, the Japanese landed on the 18th, the night of the 18th of December, and by Christmas Day, the 25th, it was all over. So within 7 days, they'd already taken half of Hong Kong Island. So within those 7 days, when you take into the accounts from the battle, from the war diaries and stuff, it's very easy to try to figure out who was where at any given time because of the fluidity of the battle. And we also find a lot of maps. Maps are fantastic resources as well, because they also tell you exactly what weapons were where, who was where the entrenchments were, where the enemy were coming from, the lines of fire. So again, it really helps give you a bigger picture of exactly who was where. The British maps are quite useful, but the ones that we really try to rely quite a lot on are the Japanese maps, purely because we don't actually have a lot of Japanese resources. We don't have a lot of the Japanese first-hand accounts. We do have a few of the military accounts, but they're a little bit harder to decipher, and they're not as in detailed as the British ones and the Allied ones. And also the Japanese also had the same problems as the Canadians as well. They're going over terrain very quickly. You know, they're not entirely sure where they are. So they get names and places slightly mixed up, which we then have to try to decipher later on when we're trying to work out exactly what we're looking for. This is another more slightly detailed Japanese map, and you might be able to see some of the slightly highlighted areas down there, and those kind of represent various cannon positions, and they're really important for us because they tell us this is where a large number of Japanese soldiers dug in, certainly for a good couple of hours. And where you find Japanese soldiers dug in, that's where you'll find bits of equipment, water bottles, bits of clipper strips for their rifles and stuff. So these are really useful places for us to go searching for. So we really try to hunt these out and try to find out as much information beforehand, because when you get out in the hills there in Hong Kong, it is pretty wild and it's very steep. So unless you have a pretty good idea where you want to go and what you're looking for, you can just spend days and days just walking around in circle, getting scratched up on some really, really messy terrain, and it gets very disheartening. So every time I hear anybody saying, what's the first thing, where's the first place I should go when I'm searching, Craig? I'm like, well, the library. You need to get down to the library. Every hour or two that you spend in the library could send you 5 or 6 hours up in the hills. So I always implore anyone to please check out maps, check out all of the resources before you go anywhere near the hills, because it will save you an awful lot of time. Another fantastic resource that we use are aerial photography. The picture that I have there is actually Wong Nai Chung. Again, the very center there. So you would be able to sort of right down there, right in the very center there is where it all kicked off. And these are fantastic resources because it gives you an idea of what that terrain looked like back then. What people don't realize in Hong Kong is that in the 1950s and 60s, I think, there was a vast reforestation program. So all of the hillsides that we see today are completely different from what it looked like in the war. And this is one thing I remember listening to when the veterans were coming back many, many years ago. They're kind of looking around going, I can remember seeing the gun pit, but I mean, all of this here just doesn't look like what it was because we've got trees and it's like jungly. Whereas back then, as you can kind of see from the picture there, it's kind of barren. The tops of the hills there are very exposed. And, you know, the highest things you would find is sort of like, you know, thigh-high shrub, bit of grass and stuff like that. Whereas today, it's a lot more jungly. So it's very quite different. But these are fantastic resources, and they're free. You can actually go onto the Hong Kong Map Service. They've got a fantastic resource there where you can go and choose what year you want, and they can give you a whole array of them, and they're free. You can actually go and pay for slightly higher resolution. So if you've got a specific project, or if you're looking for a specific area, it's worth going down and spending the extra 50 Canadian bucks or whatever it is to get a better quality aerial. But just for quick research, the Hong Kong map service really does provide you some fantastic pieces of resources there. But then what we try to do is then try to combine them. We never just use one single account. What we try to do is try to piece them all together. So what we will do is we'll read an account of some particular an account of particular ferocious fighting in an area. We'll know that the Japanese were coming from this area here. They would there was a section from the Canadians dug in here and stuff like that. So we already have a very good idea of what we're looking for where. So then what we tried to do then was we then try and look for other various sources to collaborate that. So we then try to look at the Japanese maps, and on the Japanese map up here, this little sort of symbol here of like a slightly sort of chevron looking kind of a shape there, those signify where the Japanese dug in overnight. And again, the very great places fantastic places to try to go searching, because that's where people were for a number of hours and stuff. You find all kinds of interesting items. But then what we tried to do then is compare that to some area photographs as well. So these are exactly the same place. So on the left is a Japanese battle map, and on the right is a government provided aerial. And you can see right here on the very, very top of the mountain there's what looks to be like at least 100 appears to be like little donuts, which are foxholes. So that gives us a very clear indication that the battle maps and the aerial photographs completely match up, and there's a very good chance of there's stuff being there. And this is exactly what I think this was actually one of our last projects that we did probably about 2 months ago before the heat kicked in for the summer there. So this was the last one. This is one of the last places we went. So we went and researched there. We went among all of those 100 foxholes, and this is what we found. We actually found a couple of Japanese 70mm howitzer shells. And we could then tell where the gun position was, because there was one gun pit that was completely out of shape with it all cut down, pointing right towards the other mountain where the map says they were firing. So we know exactly where the gun is, literally standing in the gun position. We also found a few sort of pieces of cutlery there that the Japanese obviously had taken at some point during the battle, because they were they use chopsticks. So we never find their Japanese cutlery, but we do find British cutlery in Japanese positions quite a lot. Then we obviously find some bits of shrapnel and sort of other sort of artillery memorabilia, and also some Japanese coins there, again, just to try to signify that there was a group of people sat there for a period of time and preparing themselves for the next part of the battle. When we go and find these different places, we find a lot of equipment. We do find both British water bottles and Japanese water bottles. About 10 years ago, when we first started it, there were quite a lot of these. We were finding quite a few of these every year. I think in total now we've probably found close to 30 of the Allied ones. And we have found a couple of the Japanese ones. They don't tend to be found too easily for some reason. But the Allied ones are really lovely when they get cleaned up there, and you can still see that kind of cobalt blue enamel on the outside. It's really beautiful to try and find those ones still lying in there in the ground. We obviously find quite a lot of other equipment as well. So what we try to do is anytime we find any piece of equipment, we're very meticulous in trying to record where it was, photograph what it is, try to itemize anything else that was in that location, just to sort of see if there was any association with it, put GPS record it. So I've got a big database, a spreadsheet of all the different items that we found going back for all of the years there. And every year we try to add to it and see if we can try and piece pieces a little of information to it. And there has been times, which I'm going to share a little bit later on, where going back and just rummaging through some old stuff has really paid dividends. And there's a story I'd like to share a little bit later on about the importance of just keeping hold of anything that you're not even sure what it is. But anytime we find an item like that, we then try to make sure we give it the maximum amount of respect. So we take an item like that and then we restore it, we clean it. And then what we try to do is try to make it as presentable as we can. So these are some examples here that we put together. These are all sort of single places there. So we haven't really mixed or matched anything. That all of those items in that one on that one display is from the same place. Try to give it a little bit more authenticity. And then what we try to do, these are actually displays here that I've given to one to my school, one to a museum, and I've got one hanging up. But we've got a couple there that are going to worthy causes and stuff, because that's where it all belongs. I mean, as much as we love finding these things, as much as we love researching them and cleaning them up and displaying them, for us, The real pleasure is actually seeing other people take up the story, trying to explaining to others and educate others about what actually happened in Hong Kong. And what we have actually noticed is there has actually been an increase in awareness. 10, 15 years ago, when we're rummaging around the hills, there are people like, oh, what, there was even a Second World War in Hong Kong? I don't even know about that. Whereas now when we're going up there quite often, people are, oh, are you looking for like the Canadian section there, or the Hong Kong volunteers? Or I read about the bombing or something like that. So there has certainly been an increase in just awareness, which is actually quite encouraging. Other items that we really love finding are more personal insignia. This then tries to give us a little bit more to try to research down. And again, talking back about understanding the movement of the battle for Hong Kong. When you start finding these insignia in certain areas, you have a pretty good idea. Well, it could have only been this group, because this area was only occupied on, say, the 22nd of December, and by the morning of the 23rd, they'd already cleared off. So there would be no reason for any Allied material to be in this location beyond that period. So whenever we find any of these kind of slightly more personal items, we try our very, very best to try to restore them and see what else we can then add to it. See if we can attribute it to a single person, or at least narrow it down to, it might be one or two of these people here. So there you can see like a bit of a Grenadiers badge. The one in the middle there is a Hong Kong Volunteers badge, which is actually a really fantastic specimen. And then the item on the right there, which I'm not sure if you can actually tell, but it's actually a compass. Sorry, you can't quite see, but that's actually a Canadian compass. And we can tell that because the equipment is, all Allied equipment is given a broad stamp that says it is a military grade, but the military stuff that's been actually manufactured in Canada actually has a C around the outside of it. So it's very quick and easy for us to tell what pieces of equipment were actually dropped by the Canadians and what was dropped by the British. It's not always the case, you know, particularly towards the latter parts of the battle where things got a little bit sort of convoluted. But certainly during the sort of beginning parts of the battle on the Hong Kong island, you have a much better understanding of who was using which equipment. So as soon as we find any kind of Canadian stamped equipment, again, we know exactly which kind of people to look for and where it most likely would have come from. Another fantastic resource is actually the bullet shells themselves. Unfortunately, you can't quite see the details on that one there, but the bullets provide an awful lot of information to us. Firstly, around the outside, they give us the head stamp, which tells us where it was manufactured and the date of manufacture. So we have a pretty good idea if it was a Canadian soldier or not, because the Canadians, they brought their own ammunition, and it has DAQ 1940 on it. And we know that the Canadians most likely used that equipment. The other sort of Hong Kong-based regiments, they were using other sort of manufactured stuff. So we know if it's got RL stamped on it, it is most likely going to be Hong Kong Volunteers. It is most likely going to be a Royal Scot, etc. So finding out what the manufacturer is gives us an awful lot of information of which people were where. The other piece of information which we can glean from the shells there is actually what weapon it was used. Because although three different types of weapon used, three different types of Allied weapons use the 303, the standard Enfield rifle, the Vickers machine gun, and the Lewis, each one of those three weapons produces a slightly different mark. And we can tell if you know what to look for. A rifle has a very, very single pin, very simple. A Bren gun has a slightly longer, deeper indentation, and it's slightly rectangular. A Lewis gun has a slightly smaller pin, but if you look halfway down the jacket, halfway down the casing, it's actually got a little bit of a dent where the ejector pushed it out. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but if you then find some 303s, you can then pretty much work out pretty quickly with these, were they Canadians, were they British, were they, what were they using, what kind of weapons were they using? And if you can then couple that with the information that you've already read, you start to build up a real clear picture of who was where doing what. And we found some pretty amazing stuff. One of my favorite items here was actually a British Tommy gun, but it could have actually been used by the Canadians. We're not entirely sure. But I mean, the very top one there, it just came out of the ground and it was just encased in rust and mud. It weighed a ton. But one of my friends here in Hong Kong is fantastic at conserving and preserving. He was the one that helps make all of those displays there. And there's not a process that he doesn't know about trying to keep wood preserve, metal preserve, various types of brass and all the rest of it. So he's fantastic at trying to make sure that we keep everything in top nick. So we don't lose any information or let things corrode away unnecessarily. So this is a Tommy gun that I found up in the hills in a Japanese position. Using the map there, we went and found a Japanese camp, overnight camp, and we found a whole ton of stuff. So this was a Tommy gun that was obviously captured at one point and buried in amongst a Japanese camp. And then this is the finished article. So this is what we end up trying to do. So after it's been cleaned and it's been preserved and it's been conserved, then we try to give it a little bit more of a museum display. So we've given it a fake stock and a handle and putting a little bit of a plastic magazine there, just to give it a little bit of a look there. So again, this is going to be going on to display in hopefully in a museum in Hong Kong, which I'm in the middle of negotiating right now. But this is the kind of quality that we're looking for at the end to try to make sure that people really respect what it is. We also find a lot of that's actually a Canadian issue rifle. We can actually tell that because there is a on all rifles there on the buttstock. There's a tiny little bit of a tag, and on that tag we could then trace it back to being a Canadian 303. But again, it's looking very, very tatty there, coming straight out of the ground there. And then after a little bit of TLC, we've given it an electrolysis bath. Then we've given it some a load of oil to try to preserve it. And then my friend has recreated it all and sectioned it for display at a school. This all leads on to the more personal stuff. I mean, we love finding, you know, big items like that, the cannon shells, the guns and stuff like that, water bottles with bayonets, they're great stuff. But what really then makes us drives us is the personal items. And I think this is one of the biggest stories I think really went through the Canadian Veterans Association here, because we had a lot of help from you guys to help resource this. One of my friends here in Hong Kong, we go out every weekend and stuff like that. He was actually doing a solo one. So this is fully his story here, but I'd like to just share it just to try and show you how we go about it. So we'd been up there at the previous weekend, and we were looking for this one kind of particular area. We read resources, we've seen the battle sites, we've seen the maps, just as I shared, and we hadn't found an awful lot. So we're leaving a little bit disheartened. Anyway, the next Monday, so a few days later, my friend Dave, he decided to go up and do a solo one. He had a day off. And in the middle of the day, I got this excited email he sent back saying, look what I found. And this is the cleaned up version. I mean, when he first found it, this is live up in the hills, and it was looking pretty muddy, pretty caked up. And we couldn't quite tell what it was. After a little bit of cleaning up there, you can probably just make out there is actually a name and even a serial number there. And on the back of the watch there, it says Private Ray D. Jackson, and even a serial number. So we were able very quickly through the great work of one of our other friends and colleagues there, Phil Cracknell, who I mentioned earlier on there, and who's a local author there. He is a fantastic friend of mine, and he's really, really good at finding out personal accounts. That's his area. He's really, really good at finding personal information and, you know, tracking down family members. So that's where we kind of we look to him, and also Tony Banham as well, to say, you know, we found this item. Is there any chance you might know somebody? Is there a relative? Can you put us into contact? And that's how this piece of this artifact managed to find its way home. So my friend up in the hills managed to find this. We cleaned it up, reached out to Phil, who then reached out to Mike Babin and also Laurie at the association. And through their fantastic connections and their tireless research, they actually managed to return it. And this is actually a presentation box that my friend Lee, again, the guy who's fantastic at making stuff. So he actually made a fantastic presentation box. I can't remember, out of beach or something like that, to then send the watch back and present to the relative of Private Jackson there, which I think Mike was actually involved with there, and very kindly was the one involved with organizing that. So that was a real sort of rewarding experience for all of us in Hong Kong, knowing that we go through all of this all this information, we go through all this time and effort, we're getting out there, sweating buckets, getting cut up, all this kind of stuff, to know that it ends up in the hands of the family member. And that's what really drives us to try and keep doing these kind of things. So that was a really fantastic result for us from seeing that. Another fantastic story. Again, this is my friend Dave. He actually found this item as well, in the same kind of Japanese resting spot as the Tommy gun. We found a lot of information there. But what this was, this really provided us an interesting information. Again, through Phil Cracknell and through his sleuth work and finding out all the various different stories, Phil was able to then track down this gentleman here, Able Seaman John Siddons. And we actually found this ID bracelet up on the hills, right in the middle of the Japanese sort of camp. nowhere near the coast, not where you would expect to find any seamen. So through some fantastic work from Phil, he actually managed that. Siddons was most likely part of a relief group that was sent up from the docks during the middle of the battle for Wong Nai Chung as extra support. He was then captured in Wong Nai Chung. And as the story unfolds, that this piece of this item of personal artifact was taken from him. It was removed along with a lot of other stuff with the people that was around him. And he was actually then sent down to one of the POW camps where he stayed for about a year. Siddons was then sent to Japan on one of the POW ships, the famous Lisbon Maru, which actually got torpedoed by an American submarine just off Formosa, Taiwan back then. So he actually survived the Battle of Hong Kong. He survived the torpedoing of the Lisbon Maru. He actually survived the machine gunning that the Japanese did of the survivors. Any of the POWs that managed to break out of the hull and were floating in the sea there, they were then sort of shot at by the Japanese on the boat there for a certain period of time. He then managed to avoid getting shot there. Eventually, he was brought back onto the Lisbon Maru. And through some fantastic research, this time through Tony Banham, which really then helped try and complete the story, he found out that Siddons died of hypothermia overnight, and he was actually buried at sea the following morning. So finding out all of this information from one tiny little piece of artifact like that, it really just helps, just build such information, the bigger picture of what Hong Kong was about. And this is just one individual. We have got thousands and thousands of individual stories like that any piece of any item like that could lead us to find. So that's actually a picture of Siddons just there. And I will ask you to go to Phil's fantastic resource of the Battle for Hong Kong military blog. And he's got a couple of really detailed articles about Siddons and the story of Siddons. I really do implore you to try and go and have a look at that. That's a fantastic place to try and get some information about the Battle for Hong Kong. This item here is actually one of the first items that got me started. And as you can see, it's just a very, very small item. And all it is half of a shoulder flash, and it's just got MC. And I said earlier on there about the importance of keeping hold of any items that you don't know, because you never know what it might lead to. And this is a perfect example, because I had this. This is one of the very first items I found. When I said that I was walking around really hesitantly, not sure what I want, just keeping things very carefully, I had this in my collection for about 2 or 3 years. And then I suddenly got a manual, and it's a really nerdy manual. It's about how to identify Japanese shell fragments. Finding the tiniest little bit of fragment, cleaning it up, counting the screws, measuring them, you can then determine what weapon it was, where it came from. So that's what I was excited about. So I pulled out all of my old bits of shrapnel and bits of rubbish and stuff, and I started cleaning it up. And one piece of shrapnel turned into this. And I then managed to unfold this amazing story that this here was actually the shoulder flash of an army medical officer in Wong Nai Chung, in the thick of it. And there were only 2 army officers that would have had this flash there. There were only 2 Europeans. The rest of them were made up by local ambulance men from St. John's. So they would not have had the same equipment as this. They would not have had the same outfits or blouses, and they wouldn't have had this. So I found this, and I then managed to find a little bit of extra information to find out that, yes, there was an army medical station in Hong Kong, in the Wong Nai Chung area. And I reached out to Phil Cracknell again, and I said, do you know anything about this? And very quickly, Phil then sent back an email saying, yes, there were 2 individuals here that were in this first aid box that would have most likely had this. A Captain Barclay, and B, a Private Evans. However, he gave us a story that both of them were captured at the Battle of Hong Kong. They were surrounded inside their pillbox with about 18, 20 stretcher bearers from the St. John's, and they tried to surrender. They tried to surrender multiple times with the Japanese. Every time they tried to come out with waving white flags and showing their medical insignia, the Japanese were shooting at them and throwing grenades into the hole, into the gaps, into the doors. So they were very reluctant to come out. Over a period of time, Captain Barclay, officer in charge, managed to come out waving a white flag. Behind him, Private Evans. They then get taken to one side. They're then the 18 stretcher bearers are mostly local Chinese. They all get bayoneted on the spot. Absolute tragedy. It's a memorial that's set up in Hong Kong, in Wong Nai Chung, and some of you might have visited it as you walk through. But I then had an opportunity to go, well, it's only one of 2 people. and doing a little bit more research, again, thanks to Phil giving us a very, very in-depth account of what actually happened through Evans. Evans was the survivor of the two, and Evans tells us an amazing story of them getting marched up to the Japanese encampment, the same encampment that we've been finding some of our other stuff. They were tied to the tree overnight, and they were subject to mock execution with the blunt aid of, the Japanese officer would raise the katana, their sword, and as they brought it down, they'd turn it at the last minute and slap them with the blunt edge. And they went through a couple of mock executions that night. And then what actually happened is as the night progressed and the soldiers settled down and fell asleep, they actually managed to cut themselves free and escape right in the middle of the Japanese encampment whilst they're all sleeping around. Evans, he decides to go south towards Stanley. Captain Barclay, he decides to go north to Wong Nai Chung. Captain Barclay is never found again. However, this item was found leading north away from the Japanese encampment. So there was a very, very good possibility. I mean, there was only a 50% chance of it anyway, but because of the location that we found, there was every chance that it had to be Barclay. And this is when I was then reached by the Canadian TV company. They contacted me and said, "Hi, we're a Canadian factual TV company. We're doing a show on finding relics, you know, personal items, you know, big items as well, talking about forts and big gun emplacements, but also the small items." And what they try to do is connect items to family, you know, try to give it a more personal touch, give it a little bit of sentimental value. And that's what the whole the show is all about. It's trying to reunite items with family members. And this was the first opportunity I did that. So when they contacted me, I said, "I've got a perfect story. I've got this little tiny little fragment." And through their diligent research there, they actually managed to find this gentleman here. And this is the son of Barclay. He is Richard Barclay. He actually lives in New Zealand. And the fantastic story was him and his mother actually were evacuated from Hong Kong when he was 4 years old. And he never has any memory of his father because his father went missing during the Battle of Hong Kong. His body was never found. And his mother married shortly after the war. And he said to himself, he felt a little bit disrespectful trying to, you know, try to research his father when his stepfather was so good to him and stuff. So he then kind of had a separate life from that. So we then reached out to him through this Canadian company and sort of showed him the stuff, and he came up to Hong Kong, and we then presented him with that little piece not far from where I found it. And it was a very emotional part because he'd said that he'd never really had any attachment to his father, but I mean, apart from a few photos there that he shared. So that was really emotional, seeing somebody, you know, for the first time having an attachment to his father, which then he then passes down to his daughter. And I'm still in contact with him now. I still send regular emails to him down in New Zealand and keep in contact with him. So that's another fantastic story of just trying to piece things together. But this is my first connection of assisting the Canadian production here. And I do want to just share a couple of other little experiences with you because I've really cherished them, and I think I've come away from a lot. The actual TV was called War Junk. Not my favorite name, but it's also under the name of Buried War and Unearthing World War I and II, because it was also showed on various UK cable networks as well. So it's on the Canadian networks and the UK under slightly different names there, depending on what you want there. So that's our hero shot there. That's actually shot in Passchendaele. So I was very fortunate to, one of the first places we went to was actually Passchendaele. So this is where this is actually in the Canadian sector as well. So this is exactly where the Canadians started rushing towards the German on the opening hours of the Passchendaele battle. And in the background there gives you a small kind of indication of just how muddy the place was, and there's just artillery lying everywhere. I mean, it's a very sort of condensed environment with lots of information, lots of various artifacts just strewn everywhere. But yes, lots of fun doing all of these different kind of TV shows. I was also really fortunate to go to the Somme, to the Canadian sectional in Beaumont Hamel. And this is the memorial there. This is a dedicated Canadian Association area, a bit the size of a big field, completely untouched since the end of the war. This is a kind of give you a picture of what it looks like today. Obviously, all the grass is kind of gone over and it's kind of faded out some of the sharpness for the trenches and stuff like that. But this is absolutely untouched, unspoilt since the last day of the war. And we were really fortunate because right down in the far end, right down by those trees, this is the Canadian front line, by the way. Those trenches there are the Canadian front line. And about 80 yards in front of that is the German front line. And right in the German front line, we were really lucky to be able to go down into a German listening station, a German listening tunnel. So we were very luckily assisted by a very expert group of tunnelers and cave rescue people. So we were there with a very expert group of people, but we were really fortunate to be able to go down, and we were the first people in there for about 50 years, I think it was. I think there was a very quick exploration 50 years ago, just to make sure it was safe and to put the hatch up on the top that you saw. But we were the first people in there for 50 years and the first ever to actually do a little bit of a sweep there with a metal detector. So that was a fantastic experience, finding a German handgun there in amongst the mud and stuff. So that was a fantastic experience, being in a German listening tunnel underneath Somme, right in amongst the Canadian lines. Another fantastic experience, and this is where I feel like I have actually contributed a little bit more to Canadian history, is Juno Beach. We went there with a task of looking for a German tribute. This is just an example, but that's what we're looking for. It is basically a one-man machine gun post, concrete machine gun post, usually sticking out at about sort of ground height here, so very difficult to see. And the reason we were looking for those is that all of the accounts of the Canadians landing on Juno Beach, 7:30 in the morning there were two of them interlocking, and they caused absolute havoc. For the first 10-15 minutes, about sort of 80% of the Canadian casualties were attributed to two of these along the beach somewhere. But over time, they got lost. They'd been lost in, I think, 1950s. There was a big storm, a hurricane that came through, completely shifted all the stand. And over time, they got lost. So that was our job, was to try to go and find these two trabucs. We had some ground penetrating radar guys coming out from Ottawa, I think it was, with their from the Canadian, from one of the universities there. They were trawling up and down, could not find it anywhere. But then really fortunately, I was actually just sitting in the Juno Beach Center there, having a cup of coffee at lunchtime, and I saw this photo up on the wall there, and I was like, well, hang on a minute. Isn't that the exact trabuk that we're looking for? Yeah. Well, we kind of know where that other item is. That's one of the command centers. Yeah. So we did a little bit of trigonometry, me and the actual sound guy. So we left the university guys doing their ground penetration. Me and the sound guy kind of went out and like, well, it looks like it's about 50 yards from there, and it looks about 100 yards from the river entrance there and stuff, the harbor entrance. So that's exactly what we did. We just kind of did a little bit of rough eye of sight. And then not long, I managed to find a really big, strong signal there on the ground. And after doing a little bit of digging, out comes a tribuk. And I was really happy about this. And this actually made the news in Canada as well, on one of the evening newses there. And I'm actually really delighted to say that this is now part of the Juno Beach Center display on the actual beach there. They've now put a fence all the way around it. They've put a plaque, and they've actually turned this into one of the tourist attractions as well. So that was quite rewarding as well. However, my favorite experience with filming and going through some of the Canadian military was actually Mount La Defensa, Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, is probably only about 5-10 miles to the right. But the big battle just before that was Monte La Defensa. The Germans were up on the top. They were not getting dislodged. So we did an assault up that route there, and we recreated the route there, and it was the famous Devil's Brigade. They climbed up overnight, camped, and then attacked the Germans the following day. And just going through over that terrain, you just do not get how rugged it is. I mean, the photo you see here on the right there, I don't know if you can quite see, it's almost a vertical cliff. It's a 20-30 meter vertical cliff, and that's just one of several sections you have to get just to get to the very, very top. So just going through that at daytime with friends, with equipment, it was a hassle. So what those guys were doing at nighttime under the cover of darkness, with artilleries going over to try to offer them some cover under the noise, I would have no idea what they went through, but I have absolute immense respect for those soldiers that went up and did that battle. And then we were also able to then go behind Monte Cassino as well and search around there. And that was a fantastic experience, really beautiful. Very quickly now, I know that I'm running out of time and I'm teaching about 15 minutes. Avenger, this is my big project. And this all really kicked off when I was given the Japanese battle map I showed at the beginning there. And up on the hills there was one site that a Japanese gun position I hadn't been to. So me and my friend, Phil Cracknell, actually on the day, Phil and I, we were crashing through, and just at the very end of the day, I happened to look down and I found this big chunk of metal under the tree. I was so fortunate, but it's about 2 feet, big chunk. Unfortunately, I wasn't prepared to bring it down that day, so I had to leave it, bring it, and then the following day I went and collected it. When I got it home, after I did a little bit of cleaning up and stuff like that, I actually managed to reveal a few bits of information from the bolts. And those bolts were quickly identified as being Second World War, American aviation close tolerance bolts. So they were definitely from an American aircraft, but I didn't know what or where, or if it was just, or whether it was just a small part of an aircraft, or if it was actually part of a wreck. So this is what actually gave me a lot of hope. I was searching and searching for weeks and weeks, extending the search area, and then I found this. This is just a 50 cal, but what you can tell from that is it's been cooked off. This hasn't been fired. This has actually been subjected to a lot of heat and has exploded in the heat, giving that really rugged shell. But that tells me instantly that this is most likely a crane crash site. These bullets were inside the aircraft, in a fire, in the explosion, and then got cooked off whilst this airplane was engulfed in flames. I then set about trying to find this place, and I was searching and I was searching, could not get anywhere. And then I had an epiphany. I was like, aerial photographs. This is the first time I really used aerial photographs. So I went down, this was before they managed to put them onto the internet. So I had to go down to the mapping office and get the specific imagery. And once I actually got this area and I zoomed in, there was a very, very clear indentation right there, not far from where I'd been searching. But I didn't really know where this was. It doesn't give me a GPS. It doesn't really kind of give me any idea of roughly where it was, except it's a scar. So this is the next technique that I use. And I have to admit, this isn't the actual crash site, obviously, because of security reasons. I can't quite tell you where this is. This is an ongoing ongoing project for this Avenger. So I can't tell you exactly where this is, but I can give you an example of what the technique that I used. So what we do is we get the first aerial photograph with whichever feature we have that's in mind. Then we overlay that on Google Earth. Now this takes a little bit of time. You have to fade in and out, and you're looking for about 3 or 4 points that crossroads, trees, or anything that you can then say this is still the same now than it was 70 years ago. And it can take 45 minutes squidging around, trying to make sure that it aligns perfectly. But it pays dividends, because once you've got that, you can then turn it into a 3D picture. And that also gives you a real lot of depth and gives you a lot of an idea of what was around where. And then you can also get a GPS as well. Once you've actually got that onto Google Earth, you can move that mouse around, and anywhere you go, you have a GPS, and it also gives you a height and elevation as well, which is really, really helpful. So this then gives us a perfect area to go search. And the very next day I went and searched, and I literally put those GPS locations, or the ones I was using, into my watch, and I was following it, and I actually stumbled on, this is the landing strut from one of the aircraft. And this is a big piece. This is a couple of £100 worth of metal there. So this is a big chunk of metal. And this was a real big piece of find here. Just up on the hillside there, as I was walking away, this shiny piece caught my eye, and I knew straight away what it was. This is a Navy arrestor hook. So every time you see a plane landing on the back of an aircraft carrier, you see that big wire there that they catch. This is the hook that catches it. So straight away, I know that this is a Navy plane. It cannot be anything else. It's not an Air Force plane. It's certainly not a civilian plane. The bullets also told me that as well. But I know that this is now a Navy plane. And we also started finding a lot of other stuff here. Bits of cockpit instrument panels, propeller mounts. These are the wheel hubs there. So this is the significant site. I knew that I'd found it. And what I was trying to do then is try to find out some records. Actually, I think I might have just jumped on there, because Phil Cracknell, that's right, sorry, Phil Cracknell, when we were talking about this, he goes, oh, I've actually got a few stories. There's actually a few POW accounts of a plane crash in this area. What you need to realize is that the POW camp was actually in Stanley, which is right in front of where this plane crashed, right? In amongst Titan is where the plane crashed, and all of the POW accounts were from Stanley. And every POW account matches up. It says 2 airplanes came, collided, 1 crashed up on the top of the hill, 1 came down further away. And we've got 4 different accounts that perfectly match up and collaborate. And when you know the location of where I found it, it is most definitely the hill on, it's definitely the plane on the upper side. But we also now have a date. We've got January the 6th, and we've got an incident. We've got 2 planes colliding. So let me just jump back one. I then went and found some of the official naval records. And after digging through, I got January the 16th records, went down the list of every missing airplane in the area, and bingo, I found 2 planes. The one at the very bottom, Hunt, and near the top there, Scoble. And the incident report says they collided over Hong Kong. So now I have a pretty good idea which incident this crash site was, but I wasn't sure which plane it was. However, because of those accounts that Phil gave me, we could determine that there was one pilot that managed to survive. It says here one pilot managed to bail out, and his was a plane that crashed higher up. So if I could identify the one surviving member of the 6 crew of the crew of those TBM, the crash report said it was a TBM. I know the crew was 3 each. There were 6 people. Only one of them survived, and I know that he came from the upper one, which is what I'm working for. So set about looking for, these are the crew, the 6 crew that died in that collision. And I went through all of those 6 there trying to find any record. And eventually I did find a record. I found a record of a Funa camp in Japan where the pilot of one of the planes actually was captured and taken to Japan, and he was kept as a POW. And it's a real tragic story because I actually managed to find a photo of him, and you look at him, he's a very handsome young chap. And doing a little bit more digging around and the research, I found this book here, The War Below. And this book's actually about sort of submarines and the battle for around Japan and stuff like that. But in there was a very, very detailed account of some of the submariners that were put in exactly the same camp as Richard Afuna. And they detailed his final few weeks. And they just said that it was horrific. He came in literally in a wheelbarrow, head to toe, covered in bandages, 3rd-degree burns, smelling he was in a very, very bad way, shall we say. And the Japanese doctors did nothing. They let him basically get septicemia, and he went absolutely delusional. And several weeks later, he basically just died on his own in a shed. And the detail in there is actually even more emotional there than I kind of said there, but it was actually quite hurtful reading that story there. But however, it did help me piece together the story there of saying this airman was the sole survivor of the plane crash, and unfortunately events led to his death after that. Last slide, very last slide now. And eventually I knew that there were 2 airplanes, so I then set about. I found the first one, I know who was in there. I then had to try to find the second one, and very, very fortunately, about 2 years later, after searching and searching and searching, I happened to find it. And that there is a 2,000-pound bomb that I know that the planes were carrying. And again, the 2,000-pound bomb is evidence to say that there was only one air raid in the whole of the Battle of Hong Kong, sorry, the whole of the Second World War, where these 2,000-pound bombs were used. 11 of them were used, and they were only used by the Navy plane. And that's one of them. So that puts it beyond any doubt that that bomb actually came from the second plane, and we also found another items there as well to also corroborate that was the plane crash site. That is the end of my presentation there. I hope I managed to keep your attention there for the most of that there, and I hope I haven't gone rambling on. So that's all I have to share for you on about that. I do have time for some very brief questions, but I know I've gone on a little bit there. So I hope to try to answer as many questions as I can, as appropriately as I can.
Well, Craig, let me first of all say that was a fabulous presentation. You are a passionate believer in what you're doing, and it's fantastic for all of us to see that. So thank you for telling us about what got you into it, how you go about doing it, and the satisfaction that you get from looking for these artifacts. It's terrific. All right, now questions. So here's a question from Jerry, 2-part question actually. How has 80 years of vegetation growth complicated the metal detection search?
That is a great question, and it's something that we actually think about every single time that we go up there. I mentioned earlier on there that the vegetation is very, very different now than it was 70 years ago through to extensive reforestation in the 60s and 70s. However, what we do find now is because Hong Kong's actually in the middle of the tropics there, we get big typhoons we get 2 or 3 big typhoons every year. And every time a typhoon comes through, it absolutely nails all of the big tall trees. Then what that then does is completely changes the vegetation the next time that we go up there. So we'll go up there and we could have been in a very, very comfortable position. We've been there dozens of times. We go up there the following season straight after a typhoon, and we're like, where is this? I mean, we're completely lost. You know, the high trees are gone and we're up to here in grass and we have no idea where we're going. So it changes all the time. But then the good side of that is there are times now that 5-10 years ago, there were patches there. We're going, we can't do that. It's just too dense. It's too thick. We're never going to get through there. However, it changes, you know, so it does give us encouragement that even though some places and pockets that we can't get to now, it's just impassable. We do hope that conditions change in the future and we are able to go back out and search other places around.
Okay, great. Jerry also wants to know, do building contractors turn over artifacts that they find when they're doing their excavations?
No, they do not give over anything. What they tend to do is, sorry about that, just trying to let somebody in there. So no, what we do find is that, no, they find bombs. They find a lot of bombs. They give them over to the construction site, and then that's where they are. But no artifacts or anything like that are ever given into to then try and be researched.
All right. Kevin wants to know, what's the legality of possessing that rusty old Tommy gun in Hong Kong? Are there any legal issues?
It is actually, it's a little bit of a thorny issue. What you do have to do is you have to be very, very careful to ensure that it is displayed. If it is 100% displayable and inactive, then yes, you can get away with it. However, in Hong Kong, there are very strict laws of ammunition and stuff. So we do need to be careful. If I was just to walk around with the street like that, holding it, then no, I'd be in a lot of trouble. But because it is designated as a display item, there is a little bit of leniency, but it is a little bit dodgy. Yes, you are right that we've got very strict laws.
All right. Ted says, first of all, extraordinary work, Craig. How much, if any, cooperation has your research received from the Japanese authorities since the end of the war?
To be honest with you, we haven't actually reached out with them for too often. I've not actually had any need to contact with them. However, what I did, a friend of mine several years ago did find some Japanese items, reached out to their embassy or consulate, and they actually then came and did like a bit of a tea ceremony as a sign of respect. So yes, there is that. Okay. But I haven't had too much experience with them.
A question from Gordon, who has been unable to find any after-action reports, situation reports, or daily orders. Have you been able to find any of these to help, or have you found a reliable source for this kind of material?
Yes. A lot of the actual first-hand accounts were actually destroyed, obviously, during the battle there. They didn't really want any papers to be left in enemy hands. However, there are records of some of them. They are kept in places like in Kew in the National Archives there, and also in other kind of places as well, like in South Africa as well, past colonies as well, in Canada as well, actually as well. So there are kind of places you can do that. To be honest with you, the best place to find that is actually Tony Bannon's book. He has most of the first-hand account verbatim in there. So I would suggest that. Now, really, so I do have time for one more question, but I've got about 22 kids about to scream. Sorry. Okay.
Well, actually, I don't see any more questions here. There is a comment. Thank you, Craig, for your research. I could listen to you for hours. And
thank you very much.
Sums up the feelings that all of us have. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're taking the time in your morning and our evening. So thank you. And I'll just remind our people in the audience that our next presentation is on June 21st, Nursing Sisters in Hong Kong, and the tour of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. So please join us for that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Good night.